Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Gary Reason. So would you ask Mr. Reason to come back in, please?
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Reason. That's it. Make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Ready to carry on? Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. Good morning to you, Mr. Reason.
Good morning.
Last night, when we finished for the day, we were discussing the question of the transmission strength of BA radios at Lakenal House. Can we move on from that, or through that, to the next document, which is the statements from the former Commissioner, Mr. Ron Dobson. And I want to look with you, please, at his third witness statement at LFB 00110652. There's the first page of it. It's dated the 30th of April 2020. Can we go, please, to page 3 and look at paragraph 11, foot of the page there. And there you see that he explains that a team led by DAC Tim Cutbill, investigated the communications difficulties at Lakenal, and that there was a report prepared, which he said addressed, as you can see at the bottom of the page, the impact of steel-framed buildings on interference with radio signals. You see that?
Yes, I see that.
And he says that, I'm summarising his evidence, ultimately fed into the LFB's Lakenal Operational Review Report. Now, what he does is that he exhibits at RJD 14 an email that he refers to. Let's look at that. It's LFB 00110657. And it's from Group Manager Zimanczyk. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
Peter Zimanczyk.
That's correct.
Thank you. Of the 13th of April 2010 to Roger Tuckley. And it shows that report has been commissioned. Now, just to be clear, Group Manager Zimanczyk was Health and Safety Services, I think.
That's correct.
And therefore within your directorate.
In 2010, I was the Assistant Commissioner Operational Resilience, so I was not in the director post when.
But within the directorate to which you ascended.
Yes.
Yes. And if we look at the second paragraph on this page after the introduction, he says this: as part of the inquiry into the Lakenal House fatal fire, a number of statements made by firefighters suggest their radios failed. However, having tracked all these statements back, I've identified that in reality only one Barry set failed and was subsequently repaired. Would you be able to provide me with a report/stroke explanation of why steel-framed buildings interfere with radio signals? And there's a response to this question from Roger Tuckley at LFB 00110659. Let's look at that. It's a little document called In-Building Radio User Difficulties. It's a one-page document. The second paragraph on that page, below the bullet points, reads as follows, and I'll show it to you. Before I do, can I ask you, have you ever seen this document before?
No, I haven't.
No. When propagating into buildings, radio signals pass through various materials before reaching a receiver's antenna. The interaction of radio signals with building materials usually results in lower signal strength. Different construction materials have different attenuation characteristics. Some construction materials very rapidly attenuate signal strength. Buildings which have a significant thickness of concrete or amount of metal used in its production will attenuate the signal. Concrete floors are often poured onto a metal pan, which completely blocks most radio signals. Some solid foam insulation and some fiberglass insulation used in exterior walls have foil backing, which will reduce signals. Energy-efficient windows and metal window screens are also very effective at blocking radio signals. To be specific, RF energy entering a building will be partially absorbed and partially reflected by the building materials encountered. Now, you weren't aware of this report, as I think you just confirmed. Can you explain why you weren't aware of this report, given your involvement a little bit later on the Lakenal House Board and the Lakenal House Working Group in and after 2013?
Well, looking at the date, and I assume this report would have been produced shortly after that email you've just shown me in 2010, I'd only just taken up a position as the Head of Operational Resilience, and I didn't sit on the Lacknell House board meetings at that point. I didn't sit on them for another 2 years.
No. At that point, who was responsible on the Lacknell House board for examining comms, if anybody?
It would have been the Head of Operational Procedures, which was Jim Knighton at the time, I believe, and his boss was Gary Dobson, who was my line manager as well. So I took over from Gary Dobson in the director position when he retired.
Right. Can you explain why, when you took over from that position, you weren't provided with this report?
I didn't know the report existed, so I don't know why I wasn't provided.
No.
I don't think, to be fair, I don't think the stuff that happened in the past, and obviously I don't know what the conclusion of this report was, the people that joined the board would have gone back, many years looking at previous documents.
Right.
That's not what I did anyway.
Right. Can we take it from that when the Lacknell House Working Group was established, and you were doing from April 2013 and May 2013 the collation exercise of the responses to the Rule 43 recommendations, nobody went back historically over the records to see what the Lacknell House board had done by way of examining the comms problems at Lacknell House?
I'm not aware that was done, but that doesn't mean it wasn't done. I'm not aware that it was done, that exercise as you describe it.
Right. Now, before this report, were you yourself aware of the limitations that building construction and materials could place on the efficacy of transmission of radio signals?
I was certainly aware that certain buildings and distance of travel were two issues that could potentially impact on fireground radio. As I said, over my evidence, I'm a very experienced operation officer, been to lots of large incidents where signal issues may have been present. So I was certainly aware buildings and distance of travel were two issues that could impact on radio efficiency.
Right. Do I take it from that answer that the problems with transmission of radio signals at Lacknell was not a new problem?
No. Various incidents we would have experienced issues with radio comms at varying degrees. Right.
I mean, your experience, I can't conceivably challenge, but did it lead at all during your time before you became DOORT to any kind of wholesale investigation about how things might be made better?
Well, some of the equipment that we introduced, certainly during my last 10 years, things like radio repeaters, leaky feeders, were all designed to overcome some of the limitations that are described in this document.
Successfully?
Yes, they do work. I won't go into the technical details of radio repeaters and leaky feeders. I think you've already aware of that. But yeah, they're designed to overcome the very issues that are reflected in this report.
Now, as we've seen from the paragraph I've read you, Mr. Tuckley's report identifies that buildings with thick concrete, metal, foam insulation with foil backing, energy-efficient windows, etc., might all impact or might entirely block radio signals. Do you agree, using your own experience, that is likely to reflect a high proportion of buildings attended by the LFB?
Yes, that is true, but that's not the same as saying that we experienced a large frequency of radio communications issues at incidents. So one of the requirements of the PRO and the PRC, the Performance Review of Operations and Performance Review of Command, is to look at incident communications. That's one of the topics that the chair of those review meetings will consider, and therefore, logically, issues relating to incident comms or incident communications equipment would appear in the IMPD reports if there was a high frequency of communications issues, and that certainly never featured in all the time that I was sitting at ODCB comms. We did put out information about communications, but there wasn't a sort of a significant trend, if to use that term, of communication failures at incidents.
But that would depend on the nature of the incident, wouldn't it?
It would depend on the nature of the incident, the building type that was involved in that incident, and the tactical plan that was deployed for those incidents.
Yes. Let's just take it in stages, because I think you've jumped to the conclusion without going through the steps with me. First, do you agree that looking at the physical attributes of the buildings described by Mr. Tuckley in this paragraph, that reflects a high proportion of buildings attended by the LFB, and around this time and thereafter?
Yes.
Yes. And do you agree that a high proportion of high-rise residential blocks in London, particularly those built or retrofitted in recent years, would have one or more of these characteristics identified by Mr. Tuckley?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Yes. Does it follow from that the LFB's radio signals may be, not always, but may be adversely affected at a significant number of operational incidents?
I'd agree with the first part of that statement, that they obviously could be affected by the issues described here, but I wouldn't say frequently. For the reasons I set out, it depends on the nature of the fire, where the fire is in the building, and the tactical plan that's used to deal with that incident.
Does it follow even from that, with your qualification, that incidents at high-rise residential blocks in London would be especially prone to problems with radio transmission?
Yes, potentially.
Yes. Now let's go to LFB 000-49878, please. Now this is an email from Tim Cutbill from David Kennett on the 24th of April 2012. And David Kennett was I think, is this right, a member of the fire safety enforcement team within the LFB?
Yes, he was.
Yes. And this is before the Lakenhall House inquest, so long before any Rule 43 recommendations. It's 11 months before that. And as we can see from the foot of the page, he's responding to a request for comments on the Lakenhall Operational Review Report. And I just want to show you what he says at paragraph 8. He says this: communications difficulties. My impression is that comms was a real issue at the incident. There are no recommendations regarding this issue. The comms problems are attributed to the construction stroke layout of the building. Bearing in mind that Lakenhall is traditional construction and not unlike many high-rise in London, the report seems to conclude that there is nothing that can be done about the difficulties experienced by the crews, with the implication that we expect to experience similar problems at future incidents. Now, you were not copied into this email, as we can see, but the question is, for you, was this issue discussed by the Lakenhall House board at this time? So this is April 2012, by which time I think you were on it.
Yeah, my first meeting was in the February of 2012.
Yes.
Obviously, there was a lot of Lakenhall board meetings. I can't remember this particular issue being an agenda item. I can't say whether we discussed it or not. I just don't remember from the meeting that was nearly 8 years ago. So unless it's in the minutes of the meetings, I can't help you on that, I'm afraid.
Right. Would you expect the issue to have been discussed at the Lakenhall board, given the importance that David Kennett has placed on it in this email?
I would expect the communications difficulty to appear in the the investigation report that was produced, that responded or took account of what the investigation team had found. So I'd read that at the time. I haven't read it recently, and I don't know if it contains a particular section around communications. I suspect it would do if there was significant communications difficulty at the incident. That would have been one of the things that the investigation team would have highlighted.
Right. Was it one of the 34 items? Action items, do you remember?
I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry.
Let's go to LFB 00106755, please. Now, the second email on this page is the email to which I want to draw your attention. It's from Jim Acourt to Tim Cutbill of the 28th of February 2013 now. We're in 2013. So this is during the Lakenhall House inquests for the purposes of the chronology. And it reads as follows: Tim, as requested, I've considered issues surrounding radio transmissions at Lacknell House with a view to identifying any reasons why radios may have appeared less effective than anticipated. My views on this are as follows, and then he sets out a lot of detail. I'm going to read quite a bit of this to you, so follow along with me. Analog radios, as used by the London Fire Brigade for communications at an incident, operate in simplex mode. This means that only one person can transmit a radio message while all people in transmission range can receive the transmission. The incident ground radios work within line of sight of each other. Essentially, this means that the radios operate best when the radio operators are able to see each other and where there are no obstructions between them. Totally unobstructed, LFB incident ground radios will transmit and receive clearly over a distance of more than 500 metres. Any obstruction between the radio transmitting and those receiving the signal will mean that the distance for effective operation will be reduced. It is not possible to easily identify the level of reduction, as the physical properties of the obstruction can make a significant difference. Steel-framed buildings are more difficult for radio signals to penetrate than simple brick-built or timber-framed buildings due to physical property of the steel. The strength of transmission in watts makes a difference to the distance over which radio transmissions can be received. The greater the transmission strength, the greater the effective distance. Incident ground radios issued to all operational personnel within the LFB are programmed with different signal strengths depending on the channel and its use. And he then lists the channels as bullet points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which we've covered already, and then goes on to say this in the next bullet point. Due to the requirement to have intrinsically safe equipment attached to breathing apparatus sets, there's a limit on the transmission strength for all BA radios used by the LFB. The limit is set at a maximum of 1 watt across all radio channels. The difference between transmission strengths means that BA radio cannot transmit as far as incident ground radios. Typically at incidents in high-rise buildings, the bridgehead is positioned 2 floors below the floor on which the fire is located. The BA entry control point with BA comms officer is usually located at the bridgehead. At Lacknell House, conditions meant that the bridgehead was actually located at ground level. This meant an extended transmission distance as well as the requirement for radio signal penetration through significant obstructions. There may be other issues, he says, and that's the end of the email. One can see that from the top of page 2, which we don't need to go to. Now, you were not copied into this email, but were you ever made aware of its contents or the detailed issues set out in it?
No, I wasn't.
Given that these discussions were happening in February 2013 and within your directorate, can you explain why you weren't ever cited on or notified of the contents or the detailed issues in this email?
I can't comment on why Jim McCourt didn't copy in his head of service, which may have prompted a discussion with myself. To be fair, some of these limitations, if you call them, and technical context of the radio capability that London Fire Brigade had at the time, I was aware of. But the answer to the question is no, I haven't seen it, and I don't know why I wasn't shown it.
Did no one ever raise these issues with you when a month later the coroner made her Rule 43 recommendations relating to communications?
I don't recall anyone raising these particular issues, but I'm aware that Group Manager Jim McCourt was one of the people that drafted the response to the incident comms issue that was presented by the Rule 43 coroner's report. So the same officer was dealing with the Brigade's proposed response to that action as it's the same author as this document.
Yes, I mean, putting yourself in the position of the person receiving that draft pro forma, the collated document we saw earlier with all the yellow highlights on it in April 2013, would you have expected Jim McCourt, in fact, to have drafted something which brought all these issues to your attention so that they could be addressed in the context of the response to the Rule 43 recommendation on comms?
To be fair to Mr. McCourt, I think some of those issues were in what I called the working draft of the pro forma, but not all of them, I accept that.
Right. Now, were you aware that similar problems with comms presented themselves at the Shirley Towers fire in Hampshire in April 2010?
I was familiar with the fatal fire report from Shirley Towers, yes.
Yes, let's look at that. And that's at LFB 00107130. let's look at the first page. There it is. The date of the fire is, as you can see, 6th of April 2010, and the report is dated the 8th of April 2010. If we look at page 53, please, let's look together at 3.10, handheld radios, finding. Well, let me just pause there. When you say you're familiar with it, did you read it at the time?
I read it at the time, yes.
Right. Did you read it in the context of your work on the Lacknell House Board or later the Lacknell House Working Group?
This became a separate Rule 43 report to ODCB, so you will be familiar with the documents we were reviewing yesterday, which focused on the Lacknell House element of that. But the bit before that covers issues that arose from the Shirley Towers fire. Yes.
You referred to that yesterday, and this is, I think, an example of that then. Now let's go to paragraph 3.10, handheld radios. Finding. The handheld radios used by HFRS, that's Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service, may not always operate effectively in high-rise buildings. These radios are also used by BA wearers to communicate with the BACO, that's the
Entry Control
Officer. The BA, Breathing Apparatus Entry Control Officer. At this incident, communications proved difficult, necessitating the need to use other forms of communications, notably mobile phones. The problem of poor radio communication in structures such as high-rise buildings or ships is well known. Post-incident testing of radios by HC showed that they were operating effectively. There were instances throughout the incident of some key personnel not having radios, e.g. the 2nd BACO. Now, as I say, this report is 8th of April 2013. We get that from page 3. We don't need to turn it up. Now, this was a week after the Lacknell Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations. Did you hear or see this report at the time, or hear about it?
I was certainly aware the report, as soon as it came to my attention that it was been published. I would have read it fairly soon after it was published, I would imagine. I can't remember the exact date, but it would have been around that time, I would imagine.
So 8th of April 2013. You would have read it around about that time. Who would have brought it to your attention, do you remember?
I can't remember. I may have gone and found it myself. Someone probably would have said it had been published. There might have even been a Chief Fire Officers Association communication about it. That would be typical when another brigade has received recommendations, coroner's recommendations. That was brought to the attention of all fire and rescue services. So it's probably that mechanism that alerted my attention that this document had been published.
Right. Do you agree that as at this time, so early April 2013, the problem of poor radio communications in high-rise buildings was now becoming well known as a result of 2 fatal high-rise fires?
Yeah, certainly radio comms within high-rise structures was known potentially to be an issue at certain incidents, yes.
Yes, known to the LFB?
Yes.
Yes. And can you tell us what your directorate was doing to combat those difficulties at that time?
Well, this report would have been reviewed to develop an action plan in response to the Rule 43, and that would have been done, the communications element of this report would have been done by the head of operational assurance, which was Jim Knighton at the time. I think he was still, at that point, he was still the head of operational policy, sorry.
Sorry, so let me just be clear. You say the communications element of this report would have been done?
Well, reviewed, should I say? That's probably a better word.
Right.
He would have been sent a copy of this to look at issues from an LFB's perspective to see if there was anything that we were going to respond to from a LFB position. Obviously, we're not responding to the Hampshire coroner, but we're responding internally.
Yes. So how would that tie in with the response to the Rule 43 recommendations that you had received about 10 days beforehand?
I can't say for sure because I wasn't the officer doing the work, but as I said, Group Manager Jim McCourt would have been the person who's leading the incident communications team, and I suspect that this report ended up on his desk in relation to this particular issue because he was our head of incident communications.
Right. Now, we've got effectively 2 Rule 43s, 2 incidents, Lacknell House and Shirley Towers. Was the LFB's response to the Shirley Towers incident and the problems identified on this page that I'm showing you in the report, something that was dealt with by the LFB separately from the response to the Lacanal Rule 43 recommendations, or to your knowledge, did Jim Acourt tie them together to produce a single composite and consistent response to the problem?
I don't honestly know the answer to that, but looking at the evidence that I'm aware of and what you showed me yesterday about the Lacanal House Rule 43, from memory, I don't think there's a specific Rule 43 action, LFB action, in response to the Shirley Towers incident communications issue. So I can assume that he did merge the two because they're obviously dealing with the same type of issue.
Right. I mean, you make that assumption based on the fact that they're the same issue, but what does that tell us about the structure of the LFB in dealing responsively with the problem, whether the problem comes from Hampshire or whether it comes from Southwark?
Well, I'm assured that the fact that the information was being dealt with by the right team, and that was the incident communications team. So in terms of your question, what does it tell us about the structure?
Yes. Let me be clearer, perhaps.
Yeah.
You assume that it was all being dealt with, that both reports, as it were on Jim Acourt's desk. What leads you to assume that he would have dealt with them as a single consistent item, both addressing the problems raised by the Shirley Towers incident and perhaps more specifically by Lacanal?
So looking at the working pro forma, as I call it, that went to the Commissioners' Board on the Lacanal House Rule 43, which obviously contained quite a bit of background information about incident communications. Reading that and then looking at these issues, they're virtually the same issue. So I would assume, I use that word again, that the outcome from a service provision point of view is that if we address the Lacanal House Rule 43, we'll also go in pretty much all the way and we'll address the issues identified in this report.
Right. Specifically focusing on this paragraph, you'll see that the author says that at this incident there was a need to use other forms of communications, notably mobile telephones. Now, was there any discussion that you knew about in the context of the response to the Lacanal Rule 43 recommendations, particularly where she had said, please look at personal communications, about whether or not it would be possible to make greater use on the fireground of mobile telephones?
I can't answer that because I didn't do the review work. As you probably know, all senior officers were issued with LFB mobile phones, so we certainly had the capability to use mobile phones. But all senior officers, station manager and above, same constituency of officer, also had airwave radio. So we already had, in effect, a tertiary opportunity to use airwave, digital radio, as a communications options at incidents if we needed to. So we wouldn't need to rely on mobile phones because we've already got a digital device that all senior officers have available to them.
Available to them, maybe. Can I just ask it this way? You receive the draft Rule 43 pro forma, I call it that, it's the document with all the yellow highlighting on we saw, on the 11th of May 2013, and you have a meeting with the other members of the commissioners group on the 14th.
Yep.
You established that. At that time, you've got Jim Acourt's response on comms embedded in the Rule 43 pro forma document. You've also read this document. At that meeting, or at that time, before Ron Dobson sent his 23rd of May letter back to the coroner, did you think to raise the possibility of using mobile telephones on the fireground as a better means of communicating between officers on the fireground, by way of satisfying the coroner's recommendation that you look at personal communications?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
Because we already had 2 command channels and the option for airwave radios, plus a number of ancillary pieces of equipment to overcome signal penetration issues. That's the repeaters and the leaky feeders, and I would have probably at that time felt that that was sufficient to overcome the issues that are identified here.
Right. Now, you say you probably would have felt at that time it was sufficient to overcome the issues. Was there any discussion of whether, in fact, that was so?
I can't remember the discussion at that meeting as I expressed yesterday, but as comms was one of the key issues, I can't rule out the fact that we obviously did talk about comms, but I can't remember the detailed discussion because it's a meeting that's over 8 years ago.
Did anybody think to ask the question, do airwave radios solve the problem encountered at Shirley Towers, which necessitated the use of mobile telephones?
I don't recall that, and I think the comms issues at Shirley Towers, from my understanding, and I've spoke to officers that are more closely informed about Shirley Towers incident, that firefighters don't have LFB issued mobile telephony devices issued to them. So if the issues were between the BA entry control, that's indicating that it's actually junior officers and firefighters, and we didn't at that time, and I think the Brigade still doesn't issue individual mobile phones to individual firefighters.
No.
So we wouldn't have had that capability at that time.
No. I can ask the same question in relation to the Lacknell House fire. In your preparations in May 2013 for the response to the Coroner's Rule 43, did anybody stand back and consider whether airwave radios would have resolved the communications or helped to resolve the communications problems encountered at Lacknell House?
Again, a similar answer. Lacknell House, as I understand it, was a slightly different issue. Certainly didn't come up at the performance review of command, so I think it was less of a command issue, maybe a firefighter issue. So again, firefighters are not issued with airwave radios, so I don't think we're in a position to roll out airwave radios to all firefighters at that time, because the contract for airwave radios was coming to its end. In theory, it hasn't materialised, as I understand now, which is not a Brigade issue; it's a national radio issue. But yeah, I think our focus would have been on what is the capability we've got available right now. What can we use? What we can develop? Is it proved understanding, better training? That would have probably been the sense of the discussion as I recall it, but I can't remember the detail of the exact discussion, I'm afraid.
Right. Now, we understand that the replacement of the handheld UHF radios and the BA radios, the breathing apparatus radios, was given consideration during your time as DOORT. Is that right?
I think there was discussion about starting a corporate project, and I think that has been done now, but subsequently after I left. So I think there was, in the programme, we have a programme of major projects that are coming up. For the same reason I discussed yesterday, you have to manage the resource commitments, yes, budgets and all the things that are related to major procurement and potentially training initiatives. So it was certainly in the work programme to look at a replacement radio system. I think it was initially for the breathing apparatus, but I think it's now been expanded to include fireground radios as well.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you remember something or a project called the replacement of incident ground communications?
It was on what we called the forward programme of projects. So there was a kind of look forward of what the major procurement projects were coming up, which usually was linked to the life-in policy for that particular piece of equipment. And that didn't expire in my time, but there was talk about setting up a radio replacement project, but I don't think the terms of reference for that project have been scoped during my time.
The project, as far as we can see, was related to Barry radios rather than...
Yeah, initially I think it started with Barry, and I think it's subsequently, again, post my retirement, has been extended to include fireground radios as well.
Yes. Now, let's go to LFB 000-88188. This is an Operational Resilience and Training Department plan for 2014 and 15, or 2014 to 15.
Yeah.
Is this a document you're familiar with?
Yes, I've seen this before.
Yes. Now, it's difficult to date this, but our best guess of this document's date is the 15th of January 2015. Would that be about right?
Yes, because if you look in the comments box on the top line, it talks about Q3. So obviously, it's that update is for Q3. So this would indicate this document is post dates Q3 of that fiscal year.
Exactly. That is precisely how we came to the conclusion that it was January 15. Can you tell us what the purpose of this document was?
Yes, so every department had a departmental service plan, which was linked to the corporate plan, which for London was the London Safety Plan, the Integrated Risk Management Plan. So the Fire Authority would sign off on the corporate plan, and then the work that flowed out of the corporate plan and the commitments in the corporate plan would, at a more granular level, result in activities and projects, etc., for each individual department. So we had a system called the Performance Management Framework, and this is a product of that process. So each head of service would have had a work programme, and this is how we, or certainly heads of service and directors, would have managed the work programme to hold their heads of service accountable for all the things that they put in their departmental plan for that financial year.
Right. Now, the first item on the list is replacement of the BA radio interface equipment, which is what Barry stands for. And if we move through the columns, the end date in the second column you can see is listed as the 21st of October 2015, and the owner, as it were, is Jim Acorte, yes?
Yes.
And in the final column you can see the update under the comments, and it says this: 7th January 2015, Q3. During the information gathering stage for this activity, it became apparent that the current Barry sets are still available and supported, and that they continue to operate effectively. Based on this information, action has been taken to defer the replacement of Barry and IS radios until 2018. The relevant OMB report has been written on behalf of the lead department, IT. It is anticipated that this will be accepted by CMB. At that point, this activity will be shown as complete. Now, Barry set radios are, just to be clear and perhaps remind people of phase one, the radios embedded within the headsets of breathing apparatus wearers, aren't they?
Yeah, not all sets, not all breathing apparatus sets, but a number of them, yes.
Yeah, yes, they wouldn't, but they wouldn't appear anywhere else.
No, they're specifically used with breathing apparatus.
Now, what information was gathered which did suggest that Barry sets were operating effectively, as this says?
I wouldn't have seen that detail. I mean, it's the same officer that wrote the report.
Jim Acorte.
Yeah, it's the same officer, but so there would have been some scoping work, as that update indicates. I don't know if you're going to take me to it, but do you know what the relevant CMB report is? What's the date on that? Because that may well. I don't remember seeing a report to Corporate Management Board on this during my time.
Well, I think I was going to ask you that, but you don't. But just going back to my question, the inquiry heard evidence at phase one that many LFB firefighters considered that the Barry sets were unreliable, and indeed AC Cotton, then Commissioner Cotton, gave evidence that she was aware of that. Were you familiar with those concerns at this time, which is just before you left?
I wasn't aware that they were unreliable in a sense that there was a major corporate issue or an operational issue. There had been some issues with the roving of the wiring to the face mask, which is where the mic and the earpiece is worked. So we'd had some issues, and in fact it was a safety event where the cabling had burnt through when firefighters had been in hot compartments, and that had caused a communications failure. So we'd done some work to resolve the roving issue, to respond to that accident investigation, but I wasn't aware that there was a kind of major issue with equipment failure or its ability to do what it was designed to do. It was getting, to the end of its life, but as that said, obviously it was still supported by the manufacturer, and I assume the maintenance contract we had for that.
Right. Now, the roving issue, is that a problem whereby in lay terms, the wiring becomes loose, which then deprives the firefighter of the ability to use the radio in the headset?
That could be one issue, but the issue that resulted in the senior accident investigation was the cables melting.
Right.
So it was because they were on the outside of the firefighting tunic, and we took management action to train firefighters to rove it in a different way so that the cabling would be protected.
Right. Were you aware of a different issue, which is simply that the Barry set could come loose, just become disconnected?
No, I wasn't.
Given what I think you have to take from me was the evidence at phase one that many LFB firefighters considered the Barry sets to be unreliable, confirmed by Commissioner Cotton at the time, and given the problems with radio transmission strength arising out of the Lacken House incident, as we've seen yesterday, do you know why the radio replacement programme wasn't prioritised?
I don't think I saw that CMB report from the head of IT, which was Julian Martin, who we spoke about yesterday. I'm fairly certain I never saw that CMB report. I assume that would have been part of the discussion in terms of if there was a recommendation in that report to defer the replacement of it. That would have been part of the discussion, but if I wasn't at the meeting, I can't really comment on that, I'm afraid.
Right, so you, to the best of your recollection, simply proceeded on what you were told in this comment column.
Yes, because I wouldn't have made a decision on this. This was a departmental plan to make sure that the various groups within these departments were doing the work that we'd set out at the start of the year. So it was a kind of performance management as well as an informative document.
But you were head of this this department, ORT, weren't you?
I was the director. I wasn't the head of this department. That was Jim Knighton initially, and then subsequently Peter Cowap.
Yes, sorry. You were head of this directorate.
Yes, I was head of the directorate, but not head. So this is a head of service sort of document. But I would have reviewed this with the heads of service.
Well, that was my next question. When you reviewed this with the heads of service, did you interrogate them as to why they thought that the current Barry sets were continuing to operate effectively?
I think if the issue was relevant to my department, specifically in terms of its performance, I did obviously go through these with the heads of service, I think quarterly from memory. I think I would have taken from that update that there's no decision, because this would be a corporate management board decision around procurement and corporate projects. So I would have assumed that a report would have been produced by the head of IT, as it says there, and then we would have had a discussion at the corporate management board level to decide whether we'd accept that recommendation from the head of IT, and hopefully that report would have set out, the advantages, disadvantages, costs, and all the other things associated with a big procurement project, and we would have made a decision based on the information within that report.
Do you remember what it was that the heads of that department told you by way of explaining to you that the Barry sets were continuing to operate effectively?
I say I wouldn't have been involved in the detailed research. So Jim McCourt was our head of comms and clearly had been the head of comms for quite a long time and had a body of knowledge and experience in this field. So we would, of course, listen to his views if it had been expressed in the CMB report. But I wouldn't be able to comment on the content of why he's making that proposal, other than what it says in the words in that box.
Now, I want to show you a document that long post-dates your departure from the LFB. It's at LFB 00105466. It's a report entitled Review of the Specification for Fireground and Breathing Apparatus Radios, dated the 29th of October 2019. So more than 2 years after the Grenfell Tower fire itself. And it was prepared by the Assistant Commissioner Operational Policy and Assurance for the Commissioner's Board of the LFC. And if we go to page page 2, paragraph 6, we can see that it says this. This issue has been highlighted by a number of fire and rescue services. And I should just explain, this issue relates to the transmission power, which is the topic that's covered in the previous paragraph or two.
Okay, thank you.
The question of IS. This issue has been highlighted by a number of fire and rescue services and in a number of investigations undertaken by the Brigade, where poor communications at incidents, including poor radio performance, has been identified as a hazard and/or factor that has contributed to injury to operational staff. Furthermore, interviews with Brigade firefighters suggest that due to experience with the poor signal propagation of BA radios, confidence in the equipment is low, and therefore it is common practice for BA teams to enter smoke-filled environments, fires, with their non-IS 4-watt fireground radios on their tunics to improve communications. While the use of a medium to high standard of IS radio for BA operations has been the historical norm in the UK, in recent years many fire and rescue services have moved away from the use of IS radios entirely and/or reduced the standards of IS protection associated with their BA radio equipment. This has been predominantly justified through a requirement to increase the effectiveness of BA radio communications, i.e. increasing available transmitting power, and through the general observation that firefighters may carry with them a range of other equipment that is not rated for intrinsic safety. There is an additional benefit in that non-IS radios can be significantly less expensive to purchase and maintain than their IS counterparts. However, National Operational Guidance, NOG, states that FRSs should consider that an explosive atmosphere is likely to occur in normal operation, and so a level of IS should be retained. Now, during your tenure, I've taken that at one go, but there are a number of questions. During your tenure at the LFB, were you aware of this issue being highlighted by other fire and rescue services?
Only in the context of the Shirley Towers report. I think the Harrow Court fatal fire review, which is a fire in Hertfordshire where 2 firefighters sadly died, I think had some communications issues, but not intrinsic safety ones from my memory, but not widely reported in the British Fire Service. But certainly there were documents like the Shirley Towers report where this issue was highlighted.
Leaving aside those other fires, Shirley Towers and Harrow Court, and perhaps looking at incidents where there were no fatalities, were you aware of a number of investigations? In other words, a body of evidence highlighting poor communications?
No, I wasn't.
Right. Were you aware that BA teams frequently use their handheld UHF radios in place of BA radios without incident commander approval?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware that many fire and rescue services had moved away from using IS radios and had reduced the level of intrinsic safety, as explained here?
No, I wasn't.
Would you expect that kind of information to have been gathered by your directorate and communicated to you during your time as director?
I think in terms of particularly given the timing of the Barry project, that may have been some of the research. I don't know if this is a 2019 document, so some of these issues may have been more recent to the publication of this document rather than the time that I served. But this is the sort of research that you would anticipate a project team that's looking to re-procure a major piece of operational equipment that's linked to safe systems of work would have taken into account, and that this sort of information would have come forward as part of a recommendation to go forward with a procurement of a particular type of radio solution. But I didn't see any of this, and it wasn't brought to my attention when I was the director.
Right. Now, given that the draft Rule 43 pro forma that we looked at yesterday, and we can go back to it if we need to, explicitly considered the possible reconsideration of intrinsically safe radios in BA sets, do you accept the possibility of using non-intrinsically safe radios in high-rise fires where there was no risk of an explosive environment, and that fact was known to your directorate in 2013?
The potential to use non-IS radios is obviously, you can do that. Radios some are IS and some aren't. I'd refer to the answer I gave yesterday. Your statement there says, I can't remember the exact words, but you might not need IS protection in a high-rise fire. As I said yesterday, I don't agree with that. I accept that the ignition source in a fire compartment is the fire itself, but I don't accept that there is never the potential for a flammable gas, a gas leak, build-up of flammable gases from the fire itself in a different part of the building isn't an explosive risk. And I really honestly believe that if we'd have tried, even if we'd have tried to introduce non-IS radios, I think we would not have got agreement with the Fire Brigade Union to do that. And I know that's speculation, which is probably not helpful for the inquiry, but I'm just trying to set out the context of my period. I just think we would not, in that period of industrial relations, and in fact from a safety point of view, be looking to downgrade the level of protection that we've already got to a worse level.
No, I understand. Just looking at the text of paragraph 6, it's clear from this report, and as I stress, this is October 2019, there had grown up a practice, as it says in the penultimate line, for BA teams to enter smoke-filled environments with their non-IS 4-watt for higher ground radios on their tunings to improve communications. In your time, to what extent was that ever the subject of a robust risk assessment so that the brigade could actually satisfy itself of whether the risk you averted to yesterday and just now was a risk that was worth taking in order to save life in the building, or was a risk that wasn't worth taking because it exposed the firefighters to too great a risk? Was that assessment ever actually done?
No.
Why is that?
I don't think it was the Brigade's position that we'd move away from national guidance on this particular safety issue at the time. That would be my personal view.
Right.
And the other thing I think it's worth just mentioning, might be helpful for context, is the issue with firefighters using their handheld radios, which is the non-IS radio. I think if that had become a significant practice that we'd have witnessed during my time, that would have featured as a safety issue, a near miss potentially, as we called them, or it would have certainly made its way in the incident management performance reports that came quarterly to the ODCB, because that would have been a concern around safe systems of work. And
I see.
I never saw a comms issue in relation to this particular issue that came forward.
Now, can I move to a different topic or subtopic, which is radio repeaters and leaky feeders? You referred to those earlier this morning.
Yep.
And TCAP training. Can we go back then to the LFB's response to the Rule 43 recommendations of May 2013 at LFB 30/42089? Just throw up the first page just to remind you of what we're looking at. This is the Dobson letter to the coroner of the 23rd of May 2013. If we go to page 8 in that, please. We can look at the bottom of page 8, and this is recommendation 5, which you can see the whole of on your screen, and proposed action at the bottom of the page, which says this: while for the reasons given above, the Brigade respectfully argues against a change in procedure concerning the use of multiple BA channels, it will be taking the following action to address the lessons learned from the Lacknell House fire. Bullet point: the Brigade will engage with its training contractor to ensure that issues relating to incident communications are embedded within the current operational training. Timescale: this work has already commenced and is estimated to be completed by December 2013. What were the issues relating to incident communications which were the subject of this proposal?
I think it was the issues highlighted by the coroner about difficulties with communication. I think it was more with firefighters than command officers at Lacknell. So the issue would have been about the whole issue of communications, using the right piece of equipment, the right channel, the options for using different channels, as we touched on yesterday, channel 1, channel 2, channel 5, channel 6, and when you experience radio difficulties, what options and equipment do you have available as firefighters, officers, incident commanders to try and assist to overcome that radio communications issues? That's what I understood the issues to cover.
I wonder if we can boil that answer down a little bit more specifically. What this letter tells the coroner is that this is about training. Brigade will engage with its training contractor to ensure that the issues relating to incident communications are embedded within the current operational training. What were you going to be teaching your firefighters and incident commanders about communications which would resolve the problem identified by the coroner, which gave rise to this recommendation?
My understanding would be similar to what I just said, is the equipment available, the channels, highlighting the issue of signal propagation, obviously explaining that there is these issues with certain types of buildings. You can experience radio communication difficulties, and then the procedures, equipment and tactics that you may deploy to overcome some of those radio issues.
I think you'd agree with me that this wasn't actually a response to the coroner's recommendation. The recommendation was for the LFB to consider using additional BA and personal comms at incidents, not to improve its training.
Yes.
Yes.
But I think the first paragraph under proposed actions, we obviously respectfully argued against
Exactly.
a change in that procedure.
But you rejected that, but as it were, told her that you'd improve training.
Yes,
Yeah.
to try and improve, operational staff's understanding of what you can do when you experience communication difficulties.
Now let's turn to LFB 3086741. This is an email chain the week before, and it relates to the meeting that we know you had on the 14th of May 2013 with the Commissioners Group. And if we can go to page 2 in the email run, please. This is an email from you to a group, as we can see, Dave Brown, James Knighton, Danny Cotton, Steve Turek, Glenn Seabright, etc. Copy to Ron Dobson, Rita Dexter, Sue Budden and David Atkinson. All, as promised, please find below a brief summary of the issues that were discussed and in some cases agreed during the 2 LACNL meetings held earlier today. Now, just pausing there, those were the meetings that we saw the invitation for, I think, in the emails yesterday or the day before.
I think the email you showed me yesterday, the invitation email, was for the commissioner groups plus the heads of service that were going to undertake the actions. I think this meeting request that I chaired was only for the officers to put together their proposals, and this was the 2 meetings to review where we got to by this date.
I follow. Now, if we go to page 3, please, we can see a heading, Outcomes from the Second Meeting. And what you've just said in your last answer, I think, relates to the second meeting, doesn't it? As a matter of logic.
Yep.
Yes. Now, can we go down, please, to recommendation 5 at the foot of your screen? Recommendation 5, Incident Communications. This email says this: it was agreed that we should state with supporting evidence why we do not agree with the first part of the coroner's recommendation to consider additional BAE radio channels. I will work with Jim and Dave to draft this evidence, which will use the benefits versus risks argument to support our position. However, it was accepted that it would be advisable to offset this by committing to undertake additional awareness raising on incident communication through some form of training across the various staff groups. What exactly were you proposing to raise awareness of?
The whole broad church of incident communications, from the equipment provision available to firefighters and officers, the use of the various radio channels that were in use at the time, and overcoming any communications failures, what additional equipment, procedures and options are available to incident commanders to resolve some of those issues that you might experience.
And would the some form of training, what did you have in mind by some form of training?
Well, again, the training commissioning process would decide the actual format of the training, but I was certainly expecting something different than just the policy note. The policy note was available to people. We had an incident communications policy note and notes for all the individual training, the equipment that was in use at the time. So I probably would envisage at this point that this would probably result in a station training support package of some kind and a senior officer computer-based training solution.
Yes. And by offset, in the penultimate line there, did you mean a SOP to the coroner?
No, not at all. I think it was just to acknowledge that we accepted that there were issues at LACNL, so we weren't just dismissing the coroner's recommendations for the reasons that you've seen in some of the highlighted texts from yesterday's document. There was a genuine concern that additional radio BA channels would actually create more problems than it would solve, and to be respectful to that, but we accepted that there were issues with radio comms that weren't just specific to BA comms at LACNL, and that we would take the appropriate action to try and improve our performance in that area.
Right. I mean, you say that, but the context of the offset remark here is that you using a benefits against risks argument to support effectively the rejection of her recommendation, but it was accepted that it would be advisable to offset this by committing to undertake additional awareness raising. It looks on the face of it that the LFB, put simply, didn't like her recommendation, was going to argue against it, but felt that it had to give her something to placate her. Would that be fair?
No, I don't think that's fair. If we'd have not accepted a recommendation, I think as an organisation we would have felt comfortable to reject it and obviously respectfully given her the reasons why. I think we did acknowledge as a group that came together to put this response together that we were not going to be complacent in this area. There were clearly radio issues that had been reported through the Lacknell investigation report, and that we would take appropriate action to try and improve our performance in that area.
Let's go back to the Communications Rule 43 pro forma at LFB 3034062. And can we go to page 10? And if we look at the very top row, this is a continuation of the considerations row we looked at yesterday. And if you look at the last paragraph, the italics read as follows: training and familiarisation of using radio equipment. There is currently sufficient policy guidance on radio use. However, there is minimal continuation training beyond the basic course within the firefighter development programme. The development of further training has been carried out by the Brigade and their training provider Babcock. These training packages for all operational personnel are expected to be completed in May 2013. And then you've got, in addition, the first bullet of the row below, which is one of the proposals to address the Rule 43 recommendations. And it says this: raise all operational personnel's awareness of the identification of communications issues at incidents and the methods of overcoming them. These include the use of UHF Channel 2 repeater and leaky feeder equipment, the completion of training materials, and the requirement to carry out training by all operational personnel on the use of radio equipment will reinforce and raise awareness of potential radio issues at incidents and improve radio discipline. Now, just to be clear, UHF Channel 2 repeater and leaker feeder equipment is a reference, isn't it, to the portable equipment that can be used by the LFB to boost or enhance weak radio signals.
It is, and there's also a fixed UHF Channel 2 repeater that's fitted to all command units as well. But yes, in principle, that's exactly what it says.
Yes, and subject to that, was it the Brigade's intention at this time, this is April, May 2013, that radio repeaters and leaky feeders should be the primary means of overcoming communications issues?
Yes, I think that's true.
Yes. And is it right that radio repeaters and leaky feeders weren't in fact deployed at the Lacknell house fire in 2009?
I honestly can't remember if they were or they weren't.
Right. Now, former Commissioner Ron Dobson gave evidence to the Lacknell House inquest on the 15th of March 2013, and I just want to show you the transcript of that day. It was day 42 of the inquest. Can we please go to CWJ 6010, page 70. Now, can we have that expanded a little bit, please, so we can see it a little bit more clearly? I'd like to pick it up in Council's question at line 22, where he was asked, what are your views on how best to overcome radio communications problems, which, as I understand it, can have two causes. One is communication blind spots in a high-rise building or a steel frame building, and, if we could turn the page, the other is sheer volume of information. And in response, if you look at page 71 at line 2, the Commissioner says this: taking those two aspects, firefighters in London are not uncommon with communications difficulty related to the building environment in which we work. So radio signals from the report we've commissioned, or many reports, particularly one that we commissioned following Lacknell House, once again identified and confirmed the signals worked best when they're in clear line of sight of each other's radios. In high-rise buildings which are constructed from steel construction and steel and concrete, there are many factors which will, something which we call shield, the signal from from getting to the radio or the one that's intended to get to. These things are not uncommon to firefighters. In the London Fire Brigade, we are, I think, unusual in relation to other brigades, that in order to try and overcome some of these problems, we issue every firefighter with a personal issue radio so that we can try to make sure that important messages to get through. I don't believe that other brigades do the same, but we certainly do issue a personal radio to every firefighter. And can I just jump ahead in his evidence to page 73, 2 pages on, and pick it up at line 5. And he says this, if we can just expand it so you can see it with me. So in terms of addressing this problem for the future, and it is, at many incident debriefs that we've attended over the years, incident ground communication is very often raised in terms of an issue, and that does relate to the shielding of the buildings and sometimes the traffic. If the shielding of the building is a problem, then there are other facilities available to incident commanders to seek to overcome that. As I recall, I think Mr. Holland referred yesterday to leaky feeders, which is basically a cable or an aerial that we run out of off the drum, like an extension lead, through a building or through an area, and that will pick up the signal and transmit it back to the base station. They are predominantly in place for long tunnels and for things like use on London Underground, where the communication issues between radios is even. The communication difficulties between radios is much greater than it usually is above ground, and it would not be the incident commander's first choice to use leaky feeders in a scenario such as Lachenal, because they would divert attention from other priority tasks to lay the cable out, but more importantly, they would represent a further hazard in the stairwell where they have to lay the cable up. So it would not be the incident commander's preference, but it would be a piece of equipment that would be available to them. Now, given Commissioner Dobson, as he then was, his evidence that leaky feeders would not be an incident commander's first choice, for the reasons he's identified, why was the decision taken to release training on their deployment and use in response to the Lachenal Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations?
I can't answer that. I think the way the training was presented, I don't think I've seen the training, would have been that it's when you experience difficulties, wouldn't be what you use as your first line of communication. That would be through your Barry set, and if you're not in an area where there's smoke or any flammable gases, then you can use your personal issue fireground radio. They would be your kind of primary methods of communication. But when you experience, which I believe the training was designed to exemplify, that if you do experience, then you do have repeaters and leaky feeders available as a kind of secondary or tertiary option for overcoming communication signal problems.
Did the LFB reconsider its policy on the use of repeaters and leaky feeders in residential high-rise fires following the Lachenal House fire?
I don't think we had a specific policy that said you should or shouldn't use them. It's just a communication capability that is available to incident commanders should they experience incident communication difficulties.
Yes. You see, the Commissioner, as I've shown you from his own evidence, explained the practical problems which lay in the way of the incident commander treating it as a primary preference where there are communications difficulties in high-rise buildings. In the light of that evidence, did the LFB stand back and actually ask itself where the use of repeaters and leaky feeders should sit in the hierarchy of alternative approaches to communications where they are experienced at high-rise fires?
I don't believe I was aware of a piece of work that does what you're describing. I would have assumed that the commissioning department that looked at the new training would have only looked at it in the context with what was currently available.
Well, let's look at that. That's TCAP 0039, and we have the form at LFB 404729. Let's have the first page up. There it is. Is that the training you're referring to? Use of authority-issued radio communication equipment.
Yeah, I wouldn't have seen this document at the time, but yes, that is the document that you're referring to.
Well, you say that. Let's see. Can we go to page 3, please? Now, on page 3, we can see the version control list there and the date of version 1 was the 27th of July 2012, and the last, version 1.3, final version, was the 10th of March 2015. The last one, I think, postdates your departure by 2 months or so.
Yeah, 3 months, yeah.
But the first three versions, 1.1 and 1.2, are all during your tenure as DOORT.
That's correct.
Yes. So it looks as if, is this right, just looking at these dates, that this training need had in fact been identified and developed sometime before the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation?
Yes, I think the timing and chronology there indicates, and I think one of Jim McCourt's emails refers to that there's already work ongoing with the training contractor. So yes, it predates the coroner's.
Yes, and I was going to ask you that. I mean, the email we saw from Jim Acorte earlier picks this up.
Yeah, picks up.
Right. Now, can we go to page 7, please, under background and context? And you can see that's the box, as is often the case with this, because it's a pro forma. On page 7, fourth box down, background context, what is the problem? And the text says this: with the introduction of new radios, it has been identified that there is a training need to ensure all operational personnel have the knowledge and understanding to use authority-issued radio communications equipment in accordance with Brigade policy to ensure effective communications at incidents. This training will cover handheld radios with associated equipment and airwave main scheme, both appliance and senior officer radios. Is the reference there to new radios a reference to the replacement of the Maxon radio by the HX series?
I know you asked me this yesterday about what date was the 5-gram radios replaced. It was definitely after the Bethel Green fire, which was 2004, yes. And my best recollection is it was around 2007 and 8. Airwave was introduced, which is the senior officer digital radios, in, I believe, 2009. So I assume it is the replacement handheld radios that they're referring to at the start of that sentence.
I mean, even in 2012, those wouldn't be
no, they wouldn't
referred to as new, would they?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe them as new at that point.
Right,
no.
But you can't think of anything else, can you?
I don't believe we purchased any new equipment in my time, no.
Right. Now, given that training was the means, or to be the means by which the LFB responded to the Lacknell Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation, even though developed beforehand, can you tell us why this form did not refer to her recommendation or the communications difficulties experienced at Lacknell, given that the last version of it is March 2015, 2 years after her Rule 43 recommendations, just under?
I can't answer that because I obviously didn't see this. Does the later versions, were they updated to reflect the work that was done in respect to the Coroner's Rule 43?
Well, we go back to page 3. This is the last version. I would have mid-March 2015.
This is the 15 version, is it?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I would have expected it to at least reference the Coroner Rule 43s and the decisions, as I've described in previous answers, about the scope of what we were trying to achieve with these two packages.
Yes. Do you know why it doesn't?
No, I don't.
Right. Were you involved in considering this training, having kicked it off as an idea, as an offset to the coroner's recommendation back in May 2013?
No, I wouldn't have been involved in the development of the TCAP process.
Right. So do I take it that you weren't involved in considering Babcock's development of this of a case study for this training, or its
no,
content?
I didn't ever see them until the case studies were produced, normally.
Did you sign off on the case studies?
No, I didn't have any involvement in the business process of signing off training that was developed by Babcock through this process.
Well, we'll see how we go with the next set of questions. Mr. Chairman, it's probably a convenient moment to take the break.
Yes, all right. Well, if you're going on to another group of questions, perhaps we should stop
Yes,
there.
we're staying within the topic, but we're going on to some follow-on questions, but it's a convenient moment because we're about to look at a new document.
Well, we'll take our morning break at that point, Mr. Reason. We'll come back at 11:30, please. And as usual, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 11:30, please. Would you ask Mr. Reason to come back in, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Reason, all ready to carry on, I hope.
I certainly am.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Reason, can we please go to LFB 001222846? This is the Babcock-produced station-based training on radio equipment, version 1. And its date, if you look at the top of the screen, is 14th of March 2014. If we go to page 2, you can see the 4 objectives of the session. By the end of this session, you will be able to list the range of radio equipment used operationally within the London Fire Brigade, describe the function of the radio equipment, select radio equipment appropriate for use in operational scenarios, demonstrate the assembly and use of Barry radio equipment. And the package then goes on to describe key items of communications equipment. Just pausing at this point, is this a training package you ever saw at all?
No, I didn't.
No. If we go to page 14, you'll see the description of the key items of communications equipment. Page 14. Breathing apparatus interface equipment. This is Barry. Intrinsically safe radio equipment suitable for use in potentially explosive atmospheres, fully splash-proof and submersible, integrated with Barry set. Appliances carry 2 Barry sets. And the next, and at page 20, if we go to that, next slide, at 20, radio repeater capability. This equipment enables radio communications to be established in locations where the signal is limited due to location, such as large basements or sub-basements. It is possible to use the repeater in both surface and subsurface environments as a standalone unit or connected to other repeaters in series mode with the supplied power cable. And then if you go to the next slide at page 21, please, you can see it says this. Radio repeater availability. 17 UHF repeaters are available. 1 repeater carried on each command unit, can also be used in conjunction with a leaky feeder, also carried by the CU. If additional repeaters are required, the IC must request them through control. Now, so far as we've been able to tell, that's the totality of the guidance in this training package on the use of repeaters. You're not familiar with it, as you've told us. Have you any reason to disagree with this proposition that this package contained only a basic description, as I've read to you, of the LFB's communications equipment and didn't prepare crews for the difficulties that may be encountered in high-rise buildings such as those experienced at Lacknell House?
I haven't seen the rest of the presentation, but I'll take your word for it that it appears from that and the intended learning outcomes that are clearly communications failures doesn't appear to be covered in the learning outcome, which I would have assumed it would have been given our previous discussion before the break. So, yeah, accepting that it doesn't develop this issue further in the remainder of the package, I accept that.
Right, and it doesn't, for example, tell you how to plug in a leaky feeder or where to plug it in or a repeater and get it to work.
It doesn't apparently, no, not from what I've seen.
No. Were you aware of any training package that prepared crews for the wholesale loss of communication or how to restore communications?
If it's not in this package, I think what I saw in the TCAP is that apart from the Phase 1 firefighter development and Phase 2 firefighter development, which covers incident communications, and I haven't seen those packages either, so they may contain more information, that this was a package designed to, in effect, deal with those issues raised by the coroner and other issues that we'd picked up from other incidents.
Let's then turn to the senior officer package at LFB 001228844. This is the radio equipment senior officer training version 1, initial upload 6th of March 2014. So the week before the version for station-based staff we saw just now. And if we go to page 3 on this document, you can see the objectives of the package listed. On completion of this package, you will be able to describe the functions and use of the analog handheld radio, radio repeater, and digital mainstream radio, describe situations where interagency voice communications and procedures can be used and how it would be implemented, identify and find solutions for radio communication issues, apply your knowledge of how radio equipment can be used to an exercise scenario. Now, in relation to radio communications issues, it appears that the relevant slides start at page 23, if we can go to that, and I'll just show you that. It reads as follows, page 23, communications issues and select radio communications. Roll over the images below for more information about how these issues can be resolved. So it looks like an interactive training package. Would that be right?
Yeah, that looks like it would be an interactive package, yes.
And it says in the box, radio relay. Where poor communications are experienced, it's possible to relay messages from one handheld radio to another. On the face of this document, did this adequately inform senior officers of the way in which high-rise materials such as concrete and metal, steel can disrupt radio signals?
If this is the only slide that covers communications issues, no, it doesn't.
No. There are a series, or is a series, of slides at page 17, if we go back 5 pages, 6 pages or so.
Mr. Millard, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but as you've already read out, this screen invites you to roll over the images for more information.
Yes.
I wonder whether there's more information we ought to be aware of.
There may
Perhaps
be.
you're going to that, I don't know.
No, because I'm not sure we have the capability of rolling this over ourselves here live.
Well, I'm sure we don't live on the screen, but do we have a copy of what you would see if you were to roll over these particular parts of the screen?
Standing here, I'm not able to answer that question, but I'm quite sure we can provide an answer. Right, we do, and we have rolled it over, and I'm told from those who have that it provides no more information, which would adequately inform senior officers of the way in which high-rise materials such as concrete and metal disrupt radio signals.
All right.
That isn't there.
Thank you very much.
Now, can we go back to page 17, which we can see explores functionality of radio repeaters and leaky feeders. And again, I mean, there's no distinction. It looks on the face of it in these slides this slide between radio repeaters and telemetry repeaters. If we just roll forward, let's look at 17, now look at 18. If we look at 18, radio repeater function modes, and there's some text which isn't very clear below it. I'll read it out to you. A single repeater is deployed in standalone mode to boost signal coverage. When used in standalone mode, the repeater can be operated by using the fist microphone, I think that says, to transmit, and the internal speaker to monitor radio traffic.
If it helps, Mr. Millett, I can confirm that this is UHF radio repeaters used in conjunction with fireground radios.
Right. I'm told that if we go to page 22 to 26 of this slide show, that's the rollover material. That's the rolled over material. If we go to 23 and 24. And then 25.
Yeah,
the images are the same.
Yeah, the things that change is the blue box at the side is giving an update on whatever box you're.
Yes.
It's a different text. I think that's how it works.
It looks from this that the LFB didn't propose to train its crews and senior officers on the distinction between radio repeaters and telemetry repeaters.
Certainly from what I've seen in this package, and I say this is the first time I've seen it, so telemetry was rolled out as a new piece of equipment, including the telemetry repeaters, I believe in 2014 from memory, and I can't remember if there was a separate training package when the new telemetry boards and associated equipment was rolled out. I would imagine it would have been, because it's quite a significant piece of safety equipment, but I can't confirm that. So it might be there is a separate package relating specifically to telemetry boards and associated equipment. I can't confirm that.
Right. Now, Peter Graves told the inquiry that although this TCAP was signed off as complete in May 2015, so after you'd left, it was never in fact released because of IT issues. Can you help us with that at all?
Certainly in 2014, I became aware that there were issues with training packages that included embedded video footage. So that was raised or given to me by James Dalglish, who was the head of Human Resource and Development. And I believe around the middle of 2014, Mr. Dalgleish was tasked by the ODCB to go and speak to the head of IT to see if we could overcome whatever the problem was with the packages. And I think from memory, it was not that the package didn't work, it was just inconsistent in its performance across the whole of the network. So we've got 100 of fire stations and other locations. So the wide area network, as we called it, which is kind of like the pipes that go to the station that you feed information down, it wasn't providing a consistent level of performance. And I think that was the issue that was raised with me, that it was impacting on the kind of user experience at fire stations. The problem didn't exist at headquarters because we had a bigger bandwidth in the headquarters building, so we didn't suffer when we reviewed training. We didn't have that problem, and so James was tasked by Miss Dexter as the chair of ODCB to speak to the head of IT to see if there was any interim solutions. And the reason I use the word interim is there was already a corporate project to upgrade the wide area network, which was the network to all fire brigade premises, and that was due to be, I can't remember if it was due to start into December 2015 or be completed in December 2015, but it was certainly quite a way away, and obviously we didn't want to wait that long. So certainly James would have raised the issue of the kind of performance issue, if that's what it was, with the head of IT. But I don't know if that's the reason why this package was delayed. I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Now, let's look at the final monitoring update you gave to the Grenfell Health Working Group for its meeting on the 31st of March 2014. We looked at it yesterday. It's at LFB 0011660. That's the first page we saw yesterday, and item 3 is the Rule 43 Action Plan, and item 5 is the update report. And if we go to page 27, you can see the start of the Action Plan Monitoring Report, and you can see Action Update March 2014. For comms, can we please go to page 33? Go to the bottom row on that page. And you can see, we looked at this yesterday, I think.
Yeah,
Brigade considers whether it would be beneficial to use additional breathing apparatus, radio, communication channels, and personal radio channels at major incidents to reduce the amount of traffic on each channel. That's the coroner's recommendation number 5. And if you look at the right-hand side, action update, it says this. Target date December 2013. 2 training packages have been commissioned for Babcock to provide training to all operational personnel on the available communications equipment and its effective use at operational incidents. The incidents chosen within these packages include both high-rise and subsurface, with scenarios that demonstrate how certain communication issues can be resolved using LFB equipment currently carried on command units. The first of these packages has now been completed and published. The second package, which is aimed at senior officers, was signed off on March 14 and will be published in April. Now, I think we've seen, am I right, both packages. We looked at the training package TCAP, and we looked at the package for station-based officers and senior officers. Given that, as Peter Groves told us, the TCAP form wasn't signed off as complete until May 2015, can you explain why you told the Grenfell Health Working Group in March 2014 that the station-based package had been completed and published when that couldn't have been the case?
The simple answer is no, but I noticed on the training package solution that you showed them that the date, it said it, I can't remember what the term was at the top, it had been loaded, I think, was consistent with the update here. Now, whether there was something that happened after I reported this, I was surprised by the 2015 date, if I'm honest. This is the update, obviously, we took through ODCP that came probably from Jim McCall, I would imagine, as the commissioning department. I would have had no reason to challenge that, because I would have taken that as, particularly the level of detail in that update. It's been, completed, published. That conveys that, we're almost there. Obviously, that's the start of the training process, but the actual process of getting that training developed is pretty much concluded. I'm surprised both by the content of the packages doesn't really reflect that update or what the intended package was designed, as far as I understood, to cover. And I'm also slightly surprised, surprised that the sign-off date is, after I've retired.
Yes. Yes. And in light of that answer, would you accept that telling the Lacknell House Working Group that the package had been completed and published was misleading, because it would cause them to believe that the package was effectively in operation and had been rolled out to staff when it had not been?
I agree with that, yes.
Yeah. Now, Peter Groves told us that the IT issues were with videos not loading properly because of poor bandwidth, and that resulted in a number of training packages not being released to LFB staff. He gave evidence, just for our reference purposes, it's day 177, page 178 at lines 14 to 19, that he'd reported that to his line manager and that was a topic of repeated discussion at the Performance and Commissioning Board meeting. Were you aware of that at this time?
Yes, I think refer to my earlier answer that certainly the embedded video packages that had an embedded video were not always working consistently across the whole of the London Fire Brigade estate, the fire stations and other locations. And that's why James Dalgleish was tasked with trying to come up with the head of IT a interim solution prior to the rollout of the new wide area network, which would obviously increase the bandwidth to stations. So I was aware in the context of a wider issue, but I was not ever aware that this particular package was one of the packages that was struggling, because from what you've shown me, and I'm not familiar with the package, it didn't look like it had embedded video, and it shouldn't have been one of the packages that was causing problems.
Well, I was going to ask you that exact question. I think although the station, the senior officer video did have a video embedded in it, or perhaps functionality with a rollover we've seen, the station-based officer training did not. So given that is the case and there's no video or functionality in that, can you explain why that wasn't rolled out, at least to station-based staff? Because IT issues wouldn't be a problem. Yeah,
I would agree with that. From what you've said, if there is no embedded video, then that shouldn't be an issue. And even the senior officer package, the vast majority of senior officers do work at headquarters or can come into headquarters to undertake training if they need better performance on the desktop, as we call it, the PC on the desk. So I've got no answer for you why that wasn't rolled out.
Right. Now, I think I take from your answer that your directorate was aware of the IT problem and its effect on the training package or packages as early as March 2014.
Yes.
Yes. And can you explain why that wasn't brought to the attention of the Lacknell House Working Group?
Well, I didn't know it. Obviously, in the update, it looked like we had completed this. I wasn't aware if there was any other Rule 43 solutions that had training packs, which I believe they are. The Policy Note 800 had a training pack. I wasn't aware that any of the training packages associated with the Rule 43s were having difficulties because of the IT infrastructure. And I would have expected if that had been the case that someone would have put it in the Rule 43 update so that we could have raised that with members.
So somebody wasn't reporting to you completely and fully, were they?
Not apparently. If the reason why this didn't get rolled out, to use the term, is because of that IT issue, which doesn't look like that is the reason from what we've discussed, I would have expected, yes, that to be reflected in the update.
Now, the simple workaround for this problem would have been to tell Babcock to remove whatever offending video there was and proceed with the rest of the training package.
For this particular item, if it was the video, and I don't know the answer to that was the problem, yes, that would have been one potential solution.
Yes, or perhaps send a CD to the stations.
Yeah, there's probably a raft of alternative solutions that we could have looked at, but probably James Dalgleish would be the best person, because he would be the person that had the conversation with the head of IT
Right.
about this issue.
And to your knowledge, were those discussions ever had to look at an alternative?
I recall from a ODCB report, because I think it was raised at ODCB around the time you said March, if that helps with your document referencing. The March ODCB 2014, I think, was where it was first raised at that board. Mr Dalgleish was given the task to speak to the head of IT to see if there was anything that they could do. From memory, obviously we tracked all the actions from ODCB. We ended up with a great long table of actions, so we didn't lose track of things. And they only got taken off once they'd been closed. There was a number of IT patches, I recall. Don't ask me what an IT patch is. It's something to do with the technology for the station end equipment, which was designed to try and overcome the performance issues. I believe one of those patches was rolled out prior to my retirement, but it didn't serve to fix the problem at the fire stations. It improved performance at other locations, but the fire stations seemed to be the problem. And I believe, and I haven't got any documentary evidence for this, it's just from memory, that the head of IT then committed to develop a second patch, as it was referred to try and fix the fire station end as an interim solution prior to the wide area network being upgraded in 2015. But I haven't got any evidence, and I can't remember whether that was completed and successful before I retired. I don't believe it was.
Right. Now, just to pin this down to a document, you referred to the ODCB meeting in March 2014. Let's just look at that. Can we go, please, to LFB 3040602? And this is the ODCB June 2014 meeting minutes. If we go to page 1, you can see that, in fact, you were not present. You gave apologies for absence.
Okay.
You see that?
Yeah.
But let's go to page 3. Under the penultimate item on that page, 10th March 2014, it says this: Babcock training packages and use of video, HOHRD, to confirm that arrangements for use of video in training packages fully exploit the terminal functionality at fire stations. And then the update is ICT need to improve links to stations for video as there is inconsistency in performance. There is no budget for improvements and may have to wait until WAN upgrade in December 2015. HOICT looking at interim solutions. Is that what you were referring to?
That's exactly what I was referring to. Thank you for that.
Yes. Now, just on the question of the budget there, you say no budget for improvements. First, did you read these minutes when they were produced after the meeting, even though you weren't at the meeting?
Yes, I would have read these minutes.
Yeah. Was there any discussion at ODCB level or lower down in the organisation about finding the money for IT improvements so that this training programme could be rolled out swiftly?
I can't remember a meeting or a report that discussed that particular issue. No, not when I was working.
Right. Can you explain why there was no budget for improvements, given the importance of this training package, which itself was anchored into the Lacknell House Rule 43 recommendation response?
Well, I expect that update in terms of the line that starts there is no budget would have come from the head of IT. So he would have been expressing that within his department that there wasn't a budget other than that, which was already committed to the wide area network. I think if we'd have discussed this and we'd wanted to do this, if there is in fact a technical solution, I'm not a technical person, so I don't know if there was a way of improving the performance without upgrading the WAN. I don't think budget would have been something that would have precluded us considering taking that forward, although the budget was obviously difficult during that period, as you probably are aware. But certainly for things like training, we would have found the money from somewhere.
I mean, some people looking at this might think that budgetary constraints explain the lack of speed in rolling this training out to station-based staff. I mean, is that a fair conclusion?
It's a conclusion, but I don't think it's the reality. I never experienced, with regards to training and things that involve frontline service delivery, that we would compromise, unless it was like a ridiculous amount of money. But for things like this, and I haven't got any sense of what the cost of upgrading the WAN was, but it wouldn't have prevented us from spending money on this if that was a viable solution. So yes, the Fire Authority was, in difficult, we had a difficult budget between 2013 and 16, as you're aware, which resulted in closure of 10 fire stations and a lot of other efficiency savings. But we never discussed that we couldn't afford to do something like this, and I don't think that budget wouldn't have been a preventative issue in this context if we'd had that discussion.
Was the difficult budget between 2013 and 2016 any explanation at all for the defects and delays in the addressing of the Rule 43 recommendations from the Lacknell House coroner?
I don't think so, no.
Now, can I then ask you about airwave radios? So far, we focused on UHF. We touched on airwave before, and we focused also on Barry. But is it right that the LFB also uses digital airwave radios and supplies them to officers on the fire ground?
Yes, they're issued to station managers and above operational staff.
Yes, and that's also called the main scheme radio, isn't it?
Yes, it's the same technology, yes.
It's the means, I think, by which the fire ground can communicate with the control room and with other emergency services.
It is indeed.
And as we understand it, airwave radios were before the Grenfell Tower fire, as you say, reserved for senior station staff, station manager, and higher ranks.
Yes.
Yes. We heard evidence at phase one that airwave radios were, where they were available, used in place of UHF radios, and that they were far superior. Somebody described them, I think it was Brian O'Keefe, as far superior to UHF radios. Was that your own experience?
They're a completely different technology. So UHF is ultra-high analog, ultra-high frequency analog, and airwave is a digital technology. So there was airwave is a national radio solution for blue lights and other agencies, and I believe the contract has something like 99.9% coverage, particularly in London, which was a requirement for the Metropolitan Police. So it's highly resilient in terms of its coverage, and obviously it's a digital trunked radio system, so it doesn't suffer some of the issues that you experience with analog radio signals.
No. Let's then go back, I think now for the final time, to the Rule 43 pro forma, LFB 30344062, page 10. And on that page we can see in the bullet point at the last bullet point in that block of text there, explore the use of digital airwave radios to provide additional command channels should communications difficulties be encountered at a specific incident. And if you go, please, to the top box, halfway down, it says this: use of airwave digital radios. Currently, these radios, issued to all flexible duty officers, are used primarily for communications between the incident ground and the brigade's mobilising control. Expanding the use of digital radio talk groups, for example, for the incident command team, would provide the opportunity to free up analogue radio channels. This does, however, bring another level of complexity in managing information flows at an incident. And then I've read you what's next to D, the final bullet there, explore the use of digital airwave radios. As with other topics which we've identified in this pro forma together during your evidence, this suggestion was never mentioned in the LFB's response to the Rule 43 letter, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Why was that?
I don't know. I would imagine that, and certainly my expectation, this would have been picked up in the wider training solution that we did commit to the coroner that we would do, and I know airwave is one of the equipment items that you showed me in the package, but yeah, I would have expected this to feature quite significantly in that new training provision.
What became of the LFB's exploration of that issue as proposed in this document?
Well, I wouldn't have been involved in the research. Obviously, I know how the radios worked. I had one myself. And I would have expected that the use of digital radios as an alternative to UHF radios in certain circumstances would have featured in that training. But I can't answer why it doesn't feature more heavily in the training solution, because I didn't see that solution.
Now, let's look at the minutes of the ODCB meeting on the 6th of May 2010. So this is 3 years before. It's at LFB 30040646. And you can see there from page 1 who was present. Rita Dexter is in the chair, and you are there as ACOEP. You see that?
Yes.
If we go to page 3, please, we can see any other business under paragraph. Oops, seems to have disappeared. There it is. This is under any other business. Action, AC/OP to consider options for use of main scheme airwave radios by borough commanders monitoring incidents. You see that?
Yes.
And if you go back to the bottom of page 2, you can see what this follows on from. At paragraph 9.1, use of main scheme airwave radios, AC/OP advised that the use of main scheme airwave radios by borough commanders in order to monitor incidents had been increasing, and there was a likelihood of the brigade being billed for usage as we are close to the limit. As a result, he'd sent out a message advising officers to only use when necessary. There were discussions regarding the pros and cons of such usage, and the suggestion was that some officers should be using the MOBIS system instead of ACOP to consider options. There's a mention there of billing for usage. Did that cost consideration, or the cost of additional airwave handsets more generally, play any part in the brigade's decision not to take the suggestion of use of airwaves further forward come April, May 2013, 3 years later?
I don't believe so. And if, with your indulgence, there's a little bit of context to this which really might help the inquiry.
Yes, please.
So this issue, I remember this issue. So when you're paged to remotely monitor an incident, we provided the MOBIS system as it's there, which is an application on a desktop, so that you could log on to the incident and you're seeing information that's being generated by the control centres. You're seeing the messages that are coming back, you're seeing people that are being mobilised, etc. So you're remotely monitoring. What started to happen around this period, bearing in mind airwave was only introduced in London Fire Brigade, I think I said 2009 from memory, that people were leaving their airwave radios switched on just because they're interested in what's going on anywhere in London. Because it's a trunk radio system, you can hear the whole of London Fire Brigade. And clearly the officers, if there's an incident in Biggin Hill, if those that are familiar with the geography of London, it's in South London, there could be an incident in Barnet, which is the diametrically opposite. And what was happening, everyone who had their airwave radio on was lighting up what's called the base stations, and we were being billed for the number of times in terms of capacity that we were lighting up those base stations. So when the contract was set up with London Fire Brigade, my understanding that we pitched ourselves in a band of usage which then attracted a cost. And we were very close to that limit because everyone was leaving their radio switched on. So it was having no performance improvement, it was just people being curious about what was going on. So this was intended to say, if you're paged for an incident, and that's how we were notified at senior manager level, we had pagers, you should initially use the MOBIS system because that gives you all the information that's coming across the radio, and other people that are not associated with that incident should not just switched on because they're interested in the incident, because it's actually going to cost the brigade money and actually delivering no performance improvement at all. Right. So that's the. I don't know if that helps. It's a slightly different issue than just the use of radios. We're not saying don't use your radio. It's just it was being used inappropriately, I suppose. Right. term.
Come 2013, was that a consideration when it came to exploring the use of airwave radios as per the bullet point in the Rule 43 draft recommendation response we've seen?
No, I don't believe it was.
Now, we understand that the LFB had access to some 70 airwave talk groups,
Yes.
which are, I think, am I right, akin to channels, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. They only ever used a handful of those talk groups with any regularity. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yes. Is it right that the LFB can actually create or adopt talk groups for specific incidents or exercises?
Yes, you can create a talk group at an incident, yes.
Would it follow from that then that an airwave channel could actually be used to set up a chain of command at an incident such as Grenfell Tower?
Yes, it could.
And that would then free up capacity on the UHF radio frequency?
Yes, all the officers that moved across to the airwave would obviously not be using their analogue radios, so that would free up capacity.
Yes. I mean, would that solution have been in keeping with the tenor of the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation on additional radio capacity?
Yes, it would.
What consideration did your directorate give to adopting that suggestion?
My understanding was airwave was covered in that training. Clearly, it's not covered in that level of detail, which is disappointing for me. Officers did use airwave radio. I've used them at very large incidents, so it wasn't that no one used the idea and weren't aware of talk groups. That was all part of the training when the airwave system was rolled out in 2009. That was explained to us how to set up a talk group, how to switch channels. It was also in policy guidance, some of the policy guidance that was updated following Lacanau, predominantly policy note 790, which was the fire survival guidance note that was redrafted in response to the experience at Lacanau, and it clearly says in that particular policy guidance that officers should consider using main scheme airwave radio when passing information relating to fire survival calls, subject to capacity in control to set up an additional main scheme radio channel. I think it's also touched on in policy note 633, but doesn't go into so much detail, but it does say, you can use main scheme airwave radio to facilitate communication between the incident command unit and the bridgehead.
Yes, but I'm really asking you about a more wholesale establishment of a chain of command at the major incident.
Yes,
So
you can put anyone, once you set the talk group up, you can then, when you're briefing officers that are arriving at the incident to do specific command or functional role capacity roles, you can tell them to switch their main scheme radio onto a particular channel, and then they'll be in communication with you.
Right. Now, in fact, let's focus on what happened in January 2013 on this topic. Can we go to LFB 3050197? This is an email chain of January 2013, so during the inquest evidence, but before the Rule 43 recommendations came out in the March of that year. And the subject matter here is as you can see, fire survival calls. Now, if you go to the email chain, if you look at the email from Graham Ellis to Neil Withers and Danielle Cotton, in the second paragraph, Graham Ellis says, and you're not copied into this, I accept, but let's see what you say. He says, I still think that we must ensure that the next generation of fireground radios may present an opportunity to link into a main scheme dedicated FSG talk channel. LAS have handheld radios that they can use to communicate locally as well as on main schemes. Now, given that those three senior officers, Graham Ellis, Neil Withers and Danny Cotton, reported to you at that time, I think, January 13.
They did.
Yes. Were you made aware of the suggestion made by Mr. Ellis here, the AC Ellis?
Not specifically, but I think the context of this email, because of the reference to John Anthony in the first sentence, might help the inquiry, John Anthony was a former assistant commissioner with the London Fire Brigade who was seconded onto the National Radio Project, which was the project designed to deliver a replacement for the airwave radio scheme, which is a national trunk radio system. And I suspect Graham's reference there is that we need to obviously liaise with John, who was representing not just London Fire Brigade, I think he was representing fire services within the region around the user specification for that replacement airwave system, which from memory it was originally designed to be delivered, and it's a government-led project, it's not a local authority fire service project, was scheduled to be delivered in the fiscal year 2015-16, but as I understand it, as of today, it still hasn't been delivered.
Right. Was any consideration given to procuring this kind of dual-purpose radio after the Lacknell House inquest, so after March 2013?
No, there wasn't.
Why is that?
I think, obviously, we've touched on the project that was in the Ops Department's departmental plan, which was looking at Barry radios. As I said, I think that has developed into a replacement radio project more widely, and we would have been aware that the airwave radio was already programmed for a major upgrade in 2015-16, and I say that is part of a national system, that we're part of a national system. So there wasn't alternative national radio systems at that time. Airwave was the national radio system for the emergency services. So I'm not sure if even if we'd have gone to the market, there was an alternative solution to what we already had. I can't say that for sure, but that's my understanding, which is why I think the government projects has run into so many difficulties, because there isn't a lot of solutions in the market.
Right. I mean, it looks from this email that the LAS, the London Ambulance Services, already had handheld radios that they could use at incidents to communicate locally. Why wasn't consideration given at that very time, particularly after the Rule 43 recommendations have come from the coroner, to do the same as the London Ambulance Service?
Well, they do a slightly different role to us, but I accept the point you're making. London Ambulance Service, I believe, are airwave users, and I think they only use airwave radios. Yes. I may be wrong, but that's my understanding. And we did have the capacity to use airwave, as we've already discussed this morning. And it was my understanding that the senior officer communications training package responding to the Rule 43 would have developed that opportunity and that capacity to a greater degree than we'd been using that system before. But clearly it didn't develop that forward. No,
and my question is, why not?
I can't answer that because I didn't see that package. If I'd have seen that package when I was working, that would have certainly been raised by me, and we'd have been investigating why it hadn't achieved what my understanding it was originally designed to achieve.
Right. Now I want to turn to another topic, or subtopic, which is LFB policy and guidance on whole-scale communication failures. We've already looked in some detail at specific aspects of the LFB's communications setup, as well as the LFB's response to the Lacknell House inquest's coroner's recommendations. I want to ask you now about the general approach of the Brigade and policy about communications on the incident ground. Can we turn, please, first to LFB 89139. This is policy number 488 on incident communications. You can see that it was issued on the 30th of January 2007 and reviewed as current on the 25th of May 2016, so after your time. If we go to paragraph 1.1 on page 2, you can see that it says, introduction, effective communications are the key to success. A reliable communications network is essential for safe operation at incidents and fundamental for securing the level of command required to manage operational resources efficiently. This policy procedure aims to standardise, simplify and improve the setting up of communications network at an incident. First of all, can I take it that you would agree with what is stated in the first sentence?
Absolutely, yes.
And second sentence?
Yes.
Yes. Do you agree that communications problems are likely to occur, or certainly at significant risk of occurring, at larger or major incidents such as Lacknell House or indeed Grenfell?
Yes, it's more likely at the larger, more complex incidents, yes.
Yes, and would it be fair to say that the amount of personnel and radio traffic at major incidents plays a role in the likelihood of communications problems arising at incidents of that kind?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
And it would follow, I think, also from that it is at such incidents that communication across incident sectors would be particularly important.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Now let's look at LFB 00105436. What I'm showing you is DAC Dominic Ellis's second witness statement to the inquiry of the 6th of March 2020. There's the first page. Can we go to page 4, please, paragraph 13? He says this. In response to question 5 of the request, there are no policies which deal specifically and exclusively with communications failures. I highlight below where a policy note refers to communications challenges which may arise in a particular operational context. The LFB's future intention is to provide clearer guidance and training on steps which ought to be taken if communications issues are experienced. I'm currently not able to say at this juncture if that information will be general in context or equipment specific. Now, I just want to focus on the word future there, given that this statement is dated March 2020, and therefore very recently, or relatively recently. Do you accept that during your tenure as DOORT, although Policy 488, as we've seen it, emphasised the importance of effective communications, particularly at major incidents that you've accepted, it doesn't offer at crews any guidance on how to ensure that communications are and remain effective?
I think there are elements of guidance in breathing apparatus policy and training relating to specific communications failures for BA crews because it's linked to emergency procedures. But I accept that for fireground radio, and indeed airwave, if we include that as a capability, the training pack that was designed in response to the Coroner's Rule 43 was, in my opinion and my understanding, was going to deal with this particular issue and give officers and crews further guidance and clarification on what they should do and what options they had available to them if they experienced communication difficulty. And then clearly, from what you've shown me, that package did not do that.
Yeah, BA policy and training related to specific communications for BA is one thing. I'm asking about Policy 488.
Yes.
Do you accept there's nothing in there?
No.
No. And nor anything in there about how to restore communications at an incident in the event that they're lost, as indeed they were at Lacanau and Grenfell?
No.
Now, the evidence we've looked at today, would you accept, shows that the LFB was aware of the limitations of its communications equipment and problems were common?
I think we were alive to the fact that the equipment we had in place at that time, you know, like all communications, even digital radio has its limitations. Mobile phones have their limitations. I think we were aware of those limitations. We had procured, before my time as director, but since the rollout of the more modern UHF radios, we'd procured a leaky feeder, repeaters, both U8FS and subsequently digital repeaters for the BA telemetry boards. So yes, we were aware. What was the second part of the question? Sorry, Mr. Millett.
Awareness that problems of communications at large incidents were common.
Limitations, problems, your word, but there were limitations. Like all equipment, there is a limitation on the equipment. Yes, we were aware of the limitations of the equipment.
Yes, and can we take it that your directorate didn't take any steps at any stage to provide an overarching communications policy or guidance on communications for operational crews so that they would be equipped to deal with communications problems on the incident ground?
Beyond what I've said about the intention of the 2 case studies or training packs in response to the Coroner's Rule 43, no, we didn't.
No, and why was that?
I believe because when I was director of the Lacanau House post-incident period was focused, and obviously comms was one of the key issues, that I believe personally that if we delivered a high-quality training package in response to that Rule 43, that we would have been addressing the issues that you've just described in terms of there was a lack of specific policy guidance for crews to know what to do in the event of communication failure.
Yes. Why wasn't that done after the Lackland House fire, or specifically after the Rule 43 in response to it?
That's the first time I've seen the content of that training, so I'm disappointed, but I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Now, we've also seen that the LFB had also seen the Rule 43 recommendations relating to the Shirley Towers fire in April 2010, report of April 2013.
Yes.
And we've seen that that was circulated, I think, within the Operational Procedures Department in October 2012.
Yes.
Just to be clear, let me show you a document to make that good. LFB 001003006. This is an email from Peter Cowup to Jim Acourt and others, including Andy Rowe and James Knighton, 8th of October 2012. Draft OP, AP for matters arising from Shirley Towers. That's the subject matter.
Yep.
It says, Dear all, please see email below and attached draft action plan for OP regarding issues arising from the Shirley Towers incident, which occurred in Southampton in April 2010. And below that, you can see there's an email from Peter Cowup to you and Danny Cotton and Dr. Bevan, which I think we saw before.
Yep.
Attaching the initial first draft review. If we go to that, it's LFB 001000307. There's a draft action plan. We'll have to open it up. If we go to the native. This may take a second or two. Bear with me, these documents take a little time to load.
It's okay. Excuse me.
Oh, thank you. Now, if we scroll down, please, to row 49, I'm going to assume you're familiar with this document because you were part of the email chain we saw. Would that be fair? Or familiar as you can be, given the lapse of time.
Yes.
If we go down to row 49, item 23, ops procedures, review definition of prolonged radio communication breakdown in relevant procedures, training materials, etc. And then in column D, GM Acourt lead officer. You see that?
Yes, I see that.
What work was done, can you tell us, in relation to that action point?
I don't know, to be honest.
You don't know what I mean, do you know why you don't know?
Well, Jim Acourt didn't report directly to me. He would have reported to a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, who then would have reported to a Head of Service, who that person would have reported to me. So I don't think I'd have seen a detailed response to this, even if there is one.
Right. Looking at it more widely, during your tenure as Director of Operational Resilience and Training, to what extent, if at all, did the LFB seek to learn lessons from communications incidents beyond fire and rescue services, for example, terrorist attacks in the UK and abroad?
I'll take that in two parts. So the international issue, London Fire Brigade did not have any processes, procedures or governance in place to learn from international events, irrespective of whether it's communication or fires or whatever. We would rely on a government lead department or possibly CFOA, Chief Fire and Rescue Officers Association, to provide guidance or to raise issues with individual fire and rescue services. That was typically how the international context was relayed to brigades. In terms of UK-based incidents, again, a bit like Shirley Towers, if there was reports available, we would typically, I suspect we would have got people to read them who was sort of covering those areas of responsibility within our service. And then if issues needed to come forward, a bit like this one, there would be a kind of a proposed action plan with lead officers allocated, and then we'd have expected that work to be progressed.
Right. You said at the start of that last answer that the LFB had no processes, procedures or governance in place to learn from international events, irrespective of whether it's communication or fires. Why is that? Why so insular, Mr. Reason?
I think the difficulty with international fires is, one, obviously we don't always get notified if they're not on the news. There is no mechanism, I don't think, unless government tell us that they've happened. That's the first point. The second point, which is a real issue, is the regulatory regimes in place in a foreign country or a different country in terms of the built environment may be very different to the environment, the legislative environment in the UK, and also the way fire and rescue services respond, both in terms of their capability and their policies, may not align to sort of UK fire and rescue service national doctrine. So whilst I'm not saying there isn't any opportunity to learn from international fires, it wasn't something that we did in my time, and I don't even think they do it now, as I understand it.
To what extent, if at all, did the LFB seek to learn lessons from other risk-critical industries in the UK?
I don't think we did.
And again, why is that?
Again, probably context. I'm not saying there isn't any lessons to learn, and probably capacity, really. We're a big organisation, but we haven't got limited resources. And as you can see, I think you can see from all the work we do, there's a lot going on. It's a complex, large organisation, and we probably wouldn't have the capacity, even if we wanted to, unless we were going to take a policy direction corporately to start looking at other organisations. I don't think it was something that we ever considered actively during my time. And that's about as best as an answer I can give. And
finally, to what extent, if at all, did the LFB give consideration to other governmental or national guidance documents when formulating its communications infrastructure and policies?
If there was national guidance, as we've touched on, things like intrinsic safety, we'd be minded to be guided by what the industry, fire service industry or government departments are putting out as guidance. We'd be minded to stick within those guidelines, but again, not looking at other industries. To use this example, communications infrastructure. Obviously, we work closely with other blue light responders, and in London they predominantly use airwave radio, which we did obviously have capability and access to.
Now I have some final questions for you, Mr. Reason. On or as at the 14th of June 2017, you had left the LFB some 2.5 years earlier.
Yes.
When you first heard the news and you saw the images of the fire, what was your immediate reaction?
Just to give it context, I was woken up to be told there was a major fire in London, and I put the television on and I saw those awful pictures, and I was just shocked that could happen in London, but in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, and I just could not imagine how that fire had occurred and how significant it had become. And obviously I didn't know then about the rapid fire spread, but just looking at the images, and this would have been about 5:30, in the morning that the fire started. It was truly shocking, and it still shocks me now.
Did you ask yourself in that moment what might have gone wrong?
Yes, of course. In preparing for this, I've done a huge amount of work for this because I care, and of course, that immediately my first thought is, blimey, this is going to be really bad for the families and people that are in that tower. Possibly there could be firefighter fatalities. In fact, at that I thought that had happened because of the sort of ticker tape update at the bottom said Brigade's confirmed fatalities, and I assumed it would be casualties in the tower, but also maybe firefighters, so that was shocking. But yeah, the whole, of course, you question yourself, what would I have done as a professional fire officer? How would I have dealt with that incident? And obviously I only could see the images. I didn't know the story at that point. But of course, as a professional fire officer, it never leaves you that sense of duty and commitment and responsibility that for the level I held in the organisation. Of course, I did start to think, should we have known about that? I didn't think that immediately because I didn't know the context, like cladding and rain screen cladding and all the things that have come out subsequently. But yeah, it never leaves you as a professional fire officer.
Did you think to yourself that this was a one-off fire that was completely unpredicted and for which the LFB could never reasonably be prepared?
I don't think I felt that straight away, but certainly, I went back to assist the London Fire Brigade with its internal investigation. But once I started to understand a little bit more about, what had happened and the sequence of events, I could have never imagined, I can only repeat what I said before, I could have never imagined a fire on that scale, and then understanding how the building, by the time I'd seen it, at 5:30 in the morning, how it managed to look like that and how it'd be so catastrophically damaged by fire. I don't think in my whole professional career, not just when I was director, I could have imagined that a fire on that scale with that tragic outcomes could have happened in the UK.
Did you look back on your own time as Director of Operations, Resilience and Training and ask yourself what you could have done in that position better to prepare the LFB for a response to the Grenfell Tower fire?
Absolutely. I mean, the scale of the tragedy is just off, on a different level than I've ever experienced. And of course you ask yourself those questions because we all do this job because we care and we want to make a difference. And, I've been very hard in scrutinising my performance, both as Assistant Commissioner and Director. But I honestly, I'm not complacent and I'm certainly not being insensitive to the families, but I just could never have imagined a fire on that scale.
And answering the question, you say you did ask yourself, are you able to identify anything that you could or should have done, which almost 2.5 years on would have better equipped the incident commander at Grenfell Tower?
With the benefit of hindsight, you're always going to do things. You always learn from every incident that I've ever been to of any reasonable scale. I can honestly say there's always things to learn, but is there one thing that I think I could have done? I honestly don't think anyone in the British Fire Service at that point in 2017 could have, dealt with a fire on that scale.
Well, Mr. Reason, thank you. Those are all the questions I have for you at this point. There may be others that those who are assisting me have, and others watching may have for you. So I'm going to ask the chairman now to take the usual end of questions break.
Yes.
Before we come back.
Well, as you probably know, Mr. Reason, when Council gets to the end of his prepared questions, we always have a break, both to give him a chance to ensure that he hasn't overlooked anything,
Yep.
and also to give others who are following these proceedings from elsewhere a chance to suggest questions that perhaps ought to be put to you arising out of your evidence. So we'll break now until 10 to 1, I think.
Okay.
And we'll come back at 10 to 1 and see if there are any more questions for you then.
Thank you.
And in the meantime, of course, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher then, please? Thank you. 10 to 1 then, Mr. Millett. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Reason to come back in, please? Good. Right, Mr. Reason. Well, we'll now see what the position is on further questions. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We've had something of a flush of questions for Mr. Reason, which, to be fair to him, I think it's appropriate that we go and consider a little bit more maturely. Given that we don't have a witness this afternoon,
Yes.
we're not going to be starting AC daily until tomorrow morning. It would probably be better if I was to ask you to rise now until 2 o'clock, if that's not inconvenient to Mr. Reason, and then deal with those further questions at 2 o'clock.
Yes. Well, Mr. Reason, I hope you didn't have anything planned for the early afternoon.
I don't. No.
I thought you probably hadn't. So it sounds to me as though it would be much more satisfactory if we took just a little bit longer than we might normally expect to deal with the additional questions. Now, Mr. Millett, I know you're very happy to work over lunch hour, but you do need time to get some lunch as well, as do others. So is the 10 minutes that you were going to get between now and 1 o'clock enough, or would you like to resume a little later than usual, say 2:15?
No, 2 o'clock is fine.
You sure?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I'm going to do two things at once, for once.
All right. Well, there we are, Mr. Reason. We'll break now. I'm sorry we're going to keep you hanging on on this basis, but I don't think there's really any sensible alternative. So we'll rise now. We'll resume at 2 o'clock, and then we'll see how the land lies. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, Mr. Millett. Well, there it is. We'll sit at 2 o'clock unless you send us a message that you do would like to have some more time.
That's very good of you, Mr. Chairman.
If you do,
I'll let you know.
we'll be very amenable to that request.
Thank you very much.
Good. All right. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock.